I'd like to get going right away so we have the maximum amount of time for our guests today. My name is Sarah Williams. I'm on the history faculty here in the School of Music and the coordinator of Peak Colloquium, in which you now are all seated, so thank you for coming. I'd like to introduce the two guests to my left on stage. You will probably all recognize Dr. Cormac Cannon, who is Director of Bands and Associate Professor of Music. Dr. Cannon has a diverse background as a conductor, composer, arranger, lecturer, and author. He is a passionate proponent of new music and has commissioned and premiered works by various composers. Today, he will be interviewing the foremost composer of music for wind ensembles today, John Mackey. John Mackey has written for major orchestras, theater, and extensively for dance, including the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, the Parsons Dance Company, and the New York City Ballet. But the majority of his work for the past decade has been for wind ensembles, and his band catalog now receives annual performances numbering in the thousands. Recent commissions include works for the BBC Singers, the Dallas Wind Symphony, military, high school, middle school, and university bands across America and Japan. In 2014, he became the youngest composer ever inducted into the American Bandmasters Association. In 2018, he received the Vladimir and Rhoda Leconte Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. The USC Wind Ensemble will perform a concert of his music featuring Professor of Clarinet Joseph Eller. This Sunday, September 24th at 4 p.m. at the Koger Center. Please join me in welcoming John Mackey.
See, I should have videoed that because my wife would be so impressed. That would be.
Maybe she's watching.
I already took a picture of you for my Instagram, so thanks.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. It's great to see you all. Everybody having a good week so far? All right. Woo. Great. Well, it is a great pleasure to have John on our campus. You heard his bio. I'm sure many of you, if you've played in band in high school or college, you've experienced John's music, and we're so glad to have him with us. This week, he's working with all of our bands here who are all working on some of his music right now, all three of our bands, working with our saxophones. He worked with our composers yesterday in a master class, which was very exciting. He's also working with a number of high schools throughout the state during his time here, so we're really proud to have him here. And thank you for giving us so much of your time.
Yeah,
we're glad.
I didn't have much choice, but yeah.
So we're going to talk about a couple of things to kind of get things started, but we really want to get to your questions as soon as we can. So there is a microphone out there, and so if you think you might want to ask a question, we're going to open it up here in just a couple of minutes. But I thought it might be nice to start, especially, John, for the folks who may be less familiar with your music, if you could just tell us a little bit about kind of where you are in your music making now, kind of what you do, what you're writing, what kind of traveling you do, kind of what your musical life entails at this point in your life.
So just like to back up a little bit, I often get asked like what instrument I play or whatever, because since I'm a composer, I never studied an instrument. My parents were amateur musicians, so I was around live music all the time. But my parents got divorced when I was 4, and I lived with just my mom, who had only gone to high school. She didn't have a college education or anything. So we were very poor, so we were not in school districts that had music departments really at all. But she still played in community orchestras and played chamber music and sang in church choir, and she couldn't afford babysitters. So it meant that I was with her at every single rehearsal that she ever went to. So I was around music and live music and different kinds of singing and orchestra things and chamber music stuff from the time I was 4, like hours and hours a week. But yeah, never played an instrument at all. And then when I was 11, my grandfather got its music program called Music Construction Set, which I think you can probably run on an emulation on your phone at this point, but at the time it was like a computer. So, he's like, "You want me to show you how to write music?" And I was like, "Okay." How hard could that be? And so he was like, so he takes me to, to the computer, and there's this program which got just a piano staff at the top of the screen and rhythmic values at the bottom of the screen, and you would move this like pointer finger around to like put the finger on top of like a quarter note, and you'd hit fire, because this was before the mouse existed. This was that long ago. So it was like an Atari 2600 style joystick with like the one orange button in the corner. And so you would like move the hand around, and you'd get to touch the quarter note, and you hit fire, and it would stick to the finger, and then you'd like drag the hand up to the piano staff and hit fire again, and like put the quarter note on the staff, and then you go down and you get like an eighth note, and you like drag it up and put it somewhere, and then you go get like maybe another eighth note. I don't know. And so, and it would take like hours, and you'd have like 2 measures of music, but it was like the coolest thing in the world, because then you hit fire on the little piano icon, it would play you your song. And at 11, that's great. That was very cool to me. Because he's like, the only rule if you want to write music is just to put the right number of beats in a measure. That's really it. He's like, music theory, I mean, between us, don't worry about that. But like, you probably all have to like take it. I had like 6 years of music theory in like undergrad and grad school, but, and I have that in the back of my head when I'm writing, but, music theory is just theory, and it's, kind of reverse engineered largely to be like, why did Bach sound like Bach? Well, if you do these things, it'll sound like Bach. That's in a nutshell what music theory is. So, it's like, here's what, European white dudes wrote 300 years ago. Here's a how-to. So that's great, but not what I'm thinking about when I write music. And I don't think what many people think about when they write music at this point. So he's like, don't worry about that stuff. Just put the right number of beats in the measure. Have fun. And that's literally all, that's still what I do. Just try to put the right number of beats in the measure. Every once in a while I'll get an email from someone that's like, this is missing a 16th rest. And like, oh man, I blew it. That's the one rule in writing music, and I blew it. But yeah, so I started writing music with software, like bad software when I was 11, and just got better and better software, and eventually went to music school for undergrad. Even though I didn't decide until my senior year of high school to be a music major. I was going to be a theater major. I was president of the drama club, and then I got impeached, and then so I was like, screw this, I'll be a composer. So like, no, that's not, I mean, the impeachment is true, but so the reason, honestly, I decided to be a composer, I didn't know if I was any good because I wasn't in band or anything. I didn't know any other composers, so I had no idea if what I was doing was any good. My mom thought it was good, but I mean, okay. So, so I was like, but I heard all the time, like, it was like, famously, no actors work. All these actors work like they're like bartenders or waiters or whatever. Like that's how you have to make a living when you're an actor. Is you have to be like a waiter. And I had never heard of a waiter who was a composer. So I was like, they must just all have jobs. Which, no, that's not at all how that worked. But I decided to go to music school, and so I had to only look at music schools that didn't require me to play an instrument to audition, which is not typical. Most music schools require composers to be proficient on some instrument. But that meant I just couldn't apply to those schools because I was not proficient on any instrument, and still am not remotely proficient on any instrument. So I went to undergrad, Cleveland Institute of Music, and then I went to Juilliard for grad school, and then that was it. And really from grad school on, mostly wrote for like dance companies, like chamber music and stuff for dance companies. I did some stuff for youth orchestras, and then I did a professional orchestra piece, and the reason I am here today, the reason I have a career at all, is 50% because of Scott Weiss, because he commissioned my first band piece with another person. The two of them, they were friends. They were like, you should write a band piece, and it should be this orchestra piece you already wrote. You should make a band version of that. And I was like, that's a terrible idea, because it's not in B flat, and it's not in 4/4. And I was like, because I didn't know what band, I was never in wind ensemble or anything. So the only thing I knew about band was like my high school marching band. So I'm like, I don't think I write music that's good with flags. It turns out I do. Like a lot of my music is marched like crazy, but like that's not the goal. So, so yeah, with Scott Weiss was like, make this Red Line Tango piece into a band piece. And so I did, and then I quit my day jobs. Like within like a year, this is all I've done.
And that's Scott Weiss, our director of orchestras here at
Yes.
USC, just to make sure
exactly.
everybody's clear about that.
Yes.
Which is that was when he was at Lamar University in
Yes.
Texas, is that right?
Yes,
Yeah.
many jobs
Many
ago for
moons
him.
ago. Yeah.
It was 20 years ago. Yeah. Yeah. So yay, Scott Weiss, for me.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we actually had a question from one of the students about, I think all of us as musicians, you already sort of referenced a couple of your early influences, but I think when we look back at our career, we always think about those people who were sort of pivotal to kind of spinning us in one direction or another, or say, hey, think about this, or try this, or a teacher. Are there other people for you who you look back and say, besides, like you mentioned early on with your mom and with Scott Weiss, pushing you into this wind ensemble trajectory? Are there other people, teachers, performers, that you can remember sort of a moment where this, I listened to this person and started thinking this way and it took me on a new path?
So there was no wind ensemble at either of my undergrads. So Juilliard does not have a wind ensemble. And Cleveland Institute doesn't have a wind ensemble. Those are just like conservatories for orchestral training, so they do not have bands. There are no saxophones, there's no, I guess the trombonists have euphoniums probably, but you can't major in euphonium at either of those schools. And now at least Juilliard has a jazz division, so there are saxophones, but it's jazz saxophone. So I was not around it at all, and I was just doing orchestra stuff and not making any money, like not paying, I couldn't live on that. I remember I did a commission, this is a long time ago, but I did a commission for a dance score, and it was like a 12-minute long thing, chamber piece, like 5 players, I think, and it was almost 15 minutes long, I think, and I was paid $750 to write it, and it took like 6 weeks to write it, and my rent in New York City was $1,800 a month. So it was impossible to to even pay my rent with what I was writing. It was just not an option. And so the way I found out about wind ensemble, it's funny, I don't think of him as a mentor because we were just classmates, but at Juilliard there were 4 of us in the composition studio. There were a bunch of professors, but our professor was a composer named John Corleano, who has like an Oscar and a Pulitzer. He's a big deal. He's amazing. So I was in that studio, and the composers in that studio were me and Stephen Bryant, who writes a lot of great wind ensemble music, Jonathan Newman, who has written some great band stuff, and Eric Whittaker was the 4th person in the studio. And so I'm hanging out with Eric in grad school. He'd be like, you should write a band piece. And I'm like, why do I do that? And he, at the time, he was writing, obviously he was writing choral music, but he was also writing band music at the same time. And the band music was making him more money than the choral music. And I thought, well, that's kind of appealing. But he's in grad school making a ton of money. Also, he's Eric Whittaker. He's always been Eric Whittaker. So you'd always see him be like, oh, I hate this guy. How is he that pretty? This is true. I spent the first 2 years of I was in grad school for 2 years, but the first year I was suspicious of him because I'm like, he's way too good looking and way too nice, and his music is way too good. Something's wrong. There's something is up with this guy. And it turns out, no, he's just a genuinely good guy. Oh, so so he was like, you should write a band piece. And I was like, I don't need to write a band piece. I'm writing this orchestra music. And I would walk back to my apartment, and he would get in his Maserati and drive away. And I'd be like, oh, maybe, that's not true. He drives a Prius, or at least he did at the time. But I was like, maybe there's something to that. And so the Midwest Band Orchestra Clinic, happens every year in Chicago, a big music education conference in Chicago in December. And one year, the other 3 people from the studio, this was after we graduated, several years after we graduated, the 3 of them went to Midwest, and they had a booth together, and they all hung out, and they came back, and one of the other guys in the studio, Jonathan Newman, was like, you should see what happens to Eric Whittaker at a band conference. And I was like, what? And Jonathan's like, he's a rock star. And I was like, that sounds cool. That sounds fun. Maybe I should research this band thing. So I was composer in residence with a youth orchestra in Minneapolis that next year. And so I was going to be out in Minneapolis for 4 weeks over the course of the school year, a week at a time, so 4 visits, a week each, to work with the youth orchestra there. And there's this big, national band convention that the wind ensemble from here has played. called CBDNA, College Band Director National Association. So that big national convention that happens every 2 years was happening in Minneapolis the same year I was in residence with the youth orchestra. And it was happening the week, a couple days before I had to be out there anyway to work with the youth orchestra. So I went out a couple days early just to go to a band conference. And that was the first time I ever heard like legit band music. And premieres of like pieces that still get played, like the H. Bob, the O Magnum Mysterium, that premiered there. A composer who I really admire a lot, but he wrote his first band piece that premiered at that conference, and he didn't think that bands could play in 5/4, but he wrote a piece in 5/4, but he barred it in 4/4 because he was afraid y'all couldn't count in 5/4, or that conductors didn't know where the fifth beat went. Like, I don't know what he was thinking, but that piece got played like one time, because that was just, first of all, insulting, and also really hard, like way harder to play something in 5 that's barred in 4. So, but I saw that premiere. But yeah, so I went to that conference and then just handed out CDs, and it was the next week that one of the Scott Weiss and Scott Stewart, called me and asked me to do a piece. But yeah, so Eric Whitacre is a big reason why I do this at all, because he pushed that for years, and eventually I gave it a try.
Which I think is interesting, because we frequently think about going to college to study with the professors, which we should do, and we should listen to the professors, right? But we learn so much from our peers, our colleagues, that we need to leave ourselves open to, listening to ideas from the other people in our studios, other people in our classes. It's not just a direct communication between the students and the teachers.
I mean, I think I got more from the colleges I went to, from the people I went to college with whom I went to college. Yeah, like the friends I made in each degree program, like completely changed how I write, and the music I know, like, hanging out with, like, my best friend in undergrad was a drummer. He's a timpani major, actually. You could major in timpani at Cleveland. Now he's a super successful Broadway drummer. He wrote like the drum book, like Next to Normal, and he's Kristen Chenoweth's tour drummer, and like he's played with Sting. He's like, by the time we were just dumb kids, like, your friends in college are just other dumb kids, and so like we would just hang out in his room listening to Rush. I'd never heard Rush before, and he's like, this is in 7. I was like, what? And so like, and then I would hang out with him, and he would show me all the stuff he could do on hi-hat that I was like, that's super cool. He also could do this crazy party trick where he could do any 4 cross rhythms at the same time with his, you would give him 4 numbers, and he would set a drum set, and with each limb he would do that rhythm. It's crazy. It's useless, but it was like really cool. He could do any 4 cross rhythms simultaneously. And yeah, so when the people you hang out with when you're in your, college years, I think it's super formative, like the friends you have there. And those are the friends that you will have forever, I think. I'm still really close with my close undergrad and grad school friends. And you don't, some of them, go on and become like artistic administrators or something, and then might recommend you for a commission or for a gig or whatever. It's like just, I wish I'd been more friends with more players of different instruments. Like, I think I totally know how to write for trombone and percussion, because my 2 closest friends were a trombonist and a percussionist. But like, I don't really know how oboe works, like, because those people were crazy. So I'm not hanging out with the oboists. Any oboists here?
Yes,
yeah,
I know there are. Yes.
I love the oboe, but a lot of mental energy goes into making those reeds, and then the thing it does to your brain, the back pressure, with like, you're just like not breathing. You're breathing so slowly. This is true. People have died performing the Strauss oboe concerto. Like, within the past 10 years, someone died, I think in San Francisco, performing the concerto, because you have no chance to breathe normally. And so people have strokes. So good luck to you.
So I'm curious if does anybody out here have a question? Maybe an oboist?
If you feel weird about going to the mic, I think the acoustics are probably fine if you want to just yell.
We have lots of things we can talk about, but we're really curious if any of you has questions. Cassie.
What made you not pick up an instrument, like, and actually study it?
So, I mean, I guess The main reasons I didn't study an instrument are, well, I mean, so being very poor meant that there was not access in the schools. But again, my mother was an amateur flutist and played flute all the time. My grandfather owned a music store. We probably could have gotten an instrument. But we moved a lot. My mother had a hard time holding down jobs. She was an alcoholic. There was all kinds of stuff that just like her attention was elsewhere. And so I think if we'd had a piano, that would have been different, but we couldn't afford a piano. So I wasn't really, and then by the time I was 11 and learned how to, do it with music software, that just seemed fun, because that was like a video game. Like playing with a computer when I was 11 was cool, and I got to make music, and it's like the kind of lamest video game in the world. Like you can't lose, really. So but I just enjoyed that, and then didn't really feel the need to learn an instrument, I guess. I do wish I had. I wish I'd learned piano, because I would just be able to write more efficiently if I could just sit at the piano and be like, but I can't. I could be like, it's like, or I can play a chord. I know what all the notes are, but I can't play any of my piano parts from any of my pieces. Like when the group was rehearsing Wine Dark Sea yesterday, and I like hear the pianist playing this stuff, I'm like, whoa, that sounds really hard. And really for like a lot of the players in the group, like I'm like, whoa, I'm sorry, that sounds really hard and awkward. I didn't know, but like I have no excuse with piano, because I could have been like, oh yeah, that's tricky, but it's not my problem. Like, my work's done. So yes.
So when you compose, do you oftentimes send parts out to people that are proficient in their instruments to make sure that, like, hey, this is doable, this is idiomatic, that sort of thing, or do you just like go out and assume that people will just figure it out?
So it depends on what level I'm writing for. So if I'm writing for the groups here, no, I'm just here's the piece. My expectation is that anything that I would come up with, the wind ensemble here can play. Like I don't question that. If I'm writing for a middle school band, which I am not good at doing, I think it's really hard to write easy music. Like technically easy music is harder to write than technically difficult music, because I can hide behind like, I'll just have the percussionists do some crazy, fill thing, or like have all the winds do some amazing, run, and the trombones we'll stack them in this and this crazy glissando. Like, no, they don't know those buttons yet. They don't, like in middle school, they don't. So like they don't know much. And so because I didn't study music ed, I never took what's it called, where you learn all the instruments.
Instrumental methods?
Yeah, I never took a methods class. I don't even know what the class is called. So, so I never took a methods class, which means I don't know how you play a B flat on a clarinet. I don't know how you do that. I know what a good oboe sounds like, but I don't know what goes into making it sound good. If I'm in a rehearsal and someone is out of tune on an instrument, I don't know how to fix that. I can tell it's out of tune, but I can't be like, oh, you should adjust whatever. I don't know. I have no idea. What? So if I'm writing for young players, I will send it to like various middle school directors or something and be like, is this okay? There was one time years ago I was writing a piece and I don't know how euphonium works still. Like, that's just a weird instrument to me. Are any euphoniums here? Let's see how many players I can just offend. So like,
I think we still have some on the list, but we'll check them all off.
Euphoniums, so the reason I don't understand euphonium is because when I learned the colors of the instruments, I didn't learn euphonium. So like growing up, I think like when you are in an age where you learn a language, your brain just is receptive like learning a language up to a certain age, and then it gets harder to learn a language. I think learning colors of instruments is a similar thing, I think. So like because I wasn't around euphonium until I was like in my late 20s that I was aware of, I didn't learn what that color would do and how it would blend with other instruments. Whereas like all of the traditional orchestral instruments, I was around all the time in person. So like I learned those colors and I know how to like make that stuff blend, but like I don't understand how euphonium works. But I mean, technically I do, but like I don't know how to make. Anyway, so There was, anyway, my point was, one time I was writing a piece and I had a really high euphonium part. Like it went up to, it was like high, like G, A, B flat, and then like back down, and it was piano. But like the high, like if it were like written on a staff, it'd be like, you know, sounding B flat in the middle of treble clef, you know. And so I post this on like Facebook, because at the time people used Facebook, that's how long ago this was. And so like I put on there, I'm like, is this a good idea or a bad idea? And all the band directors were like, that's a terrible idea. And all the euphonium players like, that's amazing. Like, you've got to do that. Like, so you got to be careful who you ask. So.
And we actually had a couple questions from students about these kinds of orchestration things. One from a trombone player who, if you may be familiar with the fact that trombones can do glisses with their slides, but you can't do any you can't gliss from, you know, between any two notes. Some of them are not possible on the instrument. And our students noticed that whenever you write a trombone gliss, it is possible.
Yes.
They work. So, sort of to Tim's question, is this something that you learned in school that was part of your orchestration classes, or was it something that you tried a gliss that didn't work and then you had to get the feedback and you had to sort of go back and forth?
I think I must have initially written an impossible glissando. And I mentioned one of my friends in undergrad was a trombonist and was like, here's how the instrument works. I was like, oh. And so I still, for every piece I write that has trombone glissandos in it, I have an orchestration book that in the back of it in the indexes just has a chart of like, on, you know, alto trombone, tenor, you know, tenor with this trigger, bass with this trigger, and it's a, you know, in every note, it shows what position you can play that in. And so I basically just have to look at like, well, you can play this note in this position, and you're in third position, but you only go between first and seventh position, so then I just make sure if I want to get to a note, how far, what partial do I need to be in, so I'll put what partial to be on. But it's not like I know how to play trombone, I just have a chart that I use, I use it a lot. Like today, we were in a rehearsal with a high school band this morning, and I have a trombone glissando that goes from like B flat to G, which is like, that's like the easiest thing in the world. You're in first position, and you go to, I don't know, 1, 2, fourth.
I'm a drummer.
But this is why I have my little chart, so I don't have to count. But the students, they were doing the glissando, and they were breaking between, like, they would start the gliss, they would slide, and then it would jump to G. I'm like, what are they doing? And it took me like 2 run-throughs through to realize they weren't starting on B flat, they misread it, and they were playing D, and you can't gliss from D to G. So then I was like, oh, you're on the 5th, not the 3rd. Anyway, so I was like, oh, yeah, that's a glissando that I know doesn't work. Yeah, so that stuff like that, you eventually learn. Because regardless of what level you're writing for, you don't want to be the person who writes an impossible glissando on the trombone. I have a percussion ensemble piece that has an out-of-range vibraphone note in it because my sample library goes higher than a normal vibraphone goes. So normal vibraphone, I think, stops on F, right? Is that the upper note? Okay, cool. See, I should know this, but my sample library, they sampled some Yamaha that goes higher. And so I wrote all these F sharps in it. But yeah, I go to like the first rehearsal. This was at Juilliard, so then they're not gonna go easy on me. So they're like, I don't have that note. I'm like, oh, sorry. So and also I would write marimba parts that were physically impossible because I would write them on the piano like they were a piano part. But a marimba is a lot wider than a piano. So if I would have something in octaves in like the bass clef and then like, they were like, this is physically impossible to like jump. I'm like, but it looks so cool. But I just don't know how, you know, big the instrument is. And with harp is really hard to write for, but I eventually, you know, enough trial and error, I like figured, and working with, that's one thing where I was smart enough to just hang out with harpists and learn, have good harpists edit my parts and show me what worked and what didn't work, and why, or like, I can play it this way, but it's easier to read if you notate it this way. Harp is a very difficult instrument to write for. Probably not as hard as guitar. I don't have any clue how to write for guitar. I mean, I can write like E7, but like I don't know. I can't show you specific notes. So.
Other questions? Yeah.
If you write a piece of music that is impossible to play, do you think that there's still a place for that music to live electronically? Do you think that that piece of music is still valid even if it can't be humanly played?
Oh, for sure. For sure. And that is one of the challenges I have, is that I am writing everything with sample libraries, and they can do anything. They never miss. They're never out of tune. I have a band piece that is way too hard. The horn parts are way too hard. Because I'd written my first band piece, Red Line Tango, and I had the Texas All-State Band was doing it, and all these kids were coming up and like asking for autographs and stuff, and this girl comes up and she's like, "Hi, I'm Autumn, and I play horn." I'm like, "All right, I'll sign whatever." And she's like, "Your horn parts are really boring." And I was like, "That's cool, Autumn." And so the next thing I wrote, I went way too far the other extreme. And in the first horn part, I wrote 32 high Cs, not in a row. So on a lot of instruments, there's like a theoretical highest note, but you can actually get away with like extended techniques and stuff, get it higher. Horn, you really don't want to write many high Cs at all. And I've never written above C. I'm sure people have. I'm sure horn players, some can do it. But like, this was for a high school band, and I wrote 32 high Cs in the first horn part. And it was over the space of like 4 minutes. So it wasn't like all, but they had rips up to them, and also because my sample library is the Vienna Philharmonic. So like, and I have the Vienna Philharmonic horns A8. So it's just a sample of all 8 horns from the Vienna Phil in unison. Like this huge epic sound, and I can do rips. So I just hit that C, and it goes reep, and it's like, although it's an F, but like, they could just rip to, and they never miss. And so I wrote this thing, and it was for this band in Japan, and the first movement is a piece called Kingfisher Sketchfire, and the first movement is super, super like slow and whatever, and then I get an email from them, and they're like, "We can do more than this." I'm like, "Okay, it's coming." And so then they get the second movement, and then I get these emails. And if you've ever seen a Japanese band, like a Japanese concert band, it's amazing. Like, what they can do in middle school is astonishing. And they have like choreography with it a lot. And it's just like, and everything is in tune and so precise, and just like, I don't know how, I mean, I've seen them rehearse the stuff, but it's just like, if you do band in high school, that's your thing. You're not having like a half dozen extracurriculars. It's band is what you picked, and so like you take it super, super, and they can play anything. So like, oh, they'll be fine. But the next email after like, this is we can play much harder than this, and they get the second movement, and they're like, she is bleeding, but she will do her best to honor you. And I was like, oh no, like what did I do? Like, I was like, oh, so that was a case where it was too much, and I didn't change it, but like. But like, they did fine. I mean, it's still the reference recording on my website, and it was like a premiere by a high school honor band, because I didn't see her bleeding afterwards, but she nailed every single C, and the piece ends with the whole horn section doing a unison rip up to high C. So like the band like gets quiet and the horns go, and then the band rest. Anyway, so when the Texas All-State Band did it, there were letters of protest because it was so hard. Because there was a horn teacher in Dallas who taught like high school horn to all these people, and she was like, we can't, there was a big email listserv, and she sends to all the horn teachers in Texas, like, do not, if your student is asked to play the Mackie on the audition, just tell them no. Just have the student be like, I won't play that. And so we all need to just like basically protest, like we're gonna boycott playing the Mackie in the audition, because if you ask high school kids to play that extreme register, then they're going to blow out their chops. They're going to be unable to play the horn again. So I get to the first rehearsal with the top band, and the top Texas All-State Band is like amazing, and 150 students. The audition process in Texas starts with 50,000 students, like high school students, and by the time they get to All-State, there are 150 in the top band. Like, these kids can do anything. And so the conductor of the group, a guy named Tom Lee, is like, so we know there was some like issue about like these horn parts are unreasonable. Like, this is too hard. And so John Mackey just wanted to address the group. But so I was like, horns, if you want to take stuff down an octave, that's fine. It's cross-cued in like cornet. Like, don't worry, like, it's totally fine. You don't have to do the high Cs, whatever you need to do to save your chops. And the girl sitting first chair, first horn, like raises her hand. I'm like, yes. And she stands up and she said, we were wondering as a section if for the last high C, we could all stand up together and do the rip in unison, standing up. And I was like, oh, yes. Because it felt like, oh, we'll show that teacher that we can do this. So that was a case where it kind of worked out, but I still get people being like, that's just unplayable. And it's bordering on unplayable. That's probably the hardest thing I have that gets played, just from that standpoint. But I do think there's something to the idea that, like in my concertos that I've written, those are nearly unplayable. I think the goal of a concerto is to do a couple things. One is to push the technique on the instrument as far as you think it can reasonably go. Like I want my concertos to be like, that's hard. And the idea is the audience hears it and they're like, that's impressive. And what my wife says is she thinks what a concerto should do is make the audience wish they could play that instrument. And I think that's an awesome goal for a concerto. For the audience to be like, oh, that's cool, I wish I could play that. But the concertos are really, really hard when they're new. But what I find is that eventually people's technique, if the piece starts to get popular, people just learn to play it, and then everyone's technique gets better. Like I have a soprano sax concerto that when it was new, no one could play it, but now college students play it on recitals all the time. Like it's just the technique, you're like, this is what you have to be able to do as an instrumentalist if you want to reach this level. So I try not to go too far past that, but I try to push it, which you'll hear in the clarinet concerto.
I was going to ask, could you tell us a little bit about this clarinet concerto?
Yes. So this was my wife's idea, because we live in San Francisco, and we went to San Francisco Ballet, and we saw Swan Lake. And I was so bored. Like, oh my God, like the big tune from Swan Lake is great, but there's another like 2.5 hours of music that happens. And so I just kept reading the synopsis over and over again until like intermission finally happened. And because I would either read the synopsis and watching them do the ballet, and I was like, that's not what that is. That's not what they're doing. No, like, they're just doing cool spins, but that's not what the story says. So anyway, I was bored, and then during intermission, was complaining to my wife about that, but she loves Swan Lake, so she was super into it. And I'm like, the synopsis is cool, and she's like, how about, for this clarinet concerto, which I had no idea what to do, she's like, how about I write you a ballet synopsis, and it will never be a ballet, but you write the score for a ballet to a story that I will give you, and that will give you something to go on. And so she wrote this whole story that I then set to music. And it's not ever been danced, it'll probably never be danced, but it made it a lot easier, because programmatic stuff is so much easier for me to write than sitting down and just being like, okay, write a piece. Like, I don't know how to do that. I need something to start with. And so she gave me the whole story. And the other thing that the group is playing is Wine Dark Sea, the symphony for band that I wrote like 10 years ago now. It's a 10-year anniversary of it. And that's based on the story of the Odyssey, which, by Homer, which I had never read because I don't read, but my wife is like really smart and really, she has her PhD from MIT. She's like that. She's literally that person. So I don't know what goes through her mind when she talks to me. Like, she's like, so she must think this is the dumbest person I've ever met. But like, she's great. She's a writer, and so she titles all of my pieces. And with Wine Dark Sea, she came up with her version of the Odyssey, and then I set that. Because I'm like, I'm not reading the Odyssey, and she's like, oh, whatever. So she did me like this Wikipedia version of the Odyssey, and like wrote out like 12 stories from the book, and I picked 3, and I was like, I could make movements of a symphony out of those 3 stories, and then she wrote slightly longer versions of each of those, and that became the program note, and then I wrote the music to sound like her program note. Because the hardest thing with making anything, like anything creative, is deciding like, what are you gonna make? And she does the hardest part. She tells me, just do that. I'm like, okay, and then I just do it. So, yeah. And often with pieces, she will just give me a title first, and then if it's a good title, then I know what it sounds like. Like right away, I'm like, oh, I know the sound world at least for that based on an evocative title. So her titles are just amazing. And she's not a musician, which is good. because like she's not invested in what it sounds like. She has ideas about what it can do as a story, but she's never like, I think it's too much trombone. Like she doesn't listen to it from a musical standpoint. It's just like if I start something and I play it for her, just like an idea I have, and she doesn't know what it's called, that's a bad sign. Like if it doesn't evoke something to her, like an image or something, then I know I'm not conveying anything clear either. But often she will tell me, like I have this piece called Aurora Wakes that I just thought it was like pretty song in E flat. Like I don't know what to call it. And I played the beginning for her or this fast part. And she's like, it sounds like sunrise. It sounds like it's just gonna get brighter and brighter. I'm like, okay, I guess I'll make it get brighter and brighter. And she's like, well, you know, sunrise doesn't start bright. So maybe, I don't know, the beginning seems weird. And she's like, I think it's called Aurora Awakes. I'm like, oh, great. And so I made a sunrise piece, but all I had written was like 16 measures of like fast motor music. But because she gave me a title and told me what it evoked to her, then I got a whole piece out of it.
So you're talking a lot about the difference between making music for musicians or sort of in the academy, as we talk about sometimes, but the importance of people who are not trained musicians and what they hear in our music making and how we reach them.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about how you think about reaching people with your music beyond just what the people performing it are going to think?
Yeah, there's an interesting balance. I actually don't think so much if I'm writing a hard piece, like if I'm writing something for a university group, I'm not really worried too much about how fun the parts are to play. I want the audience to like it. I want, like, what I think about when I have a title first is I just imagine, what if I went into a concert hall and I opened the program and I read that title? What's gonna happen? And that's how a piece generally starts. But I know a journey I want to take an audience on more than journey I want to take the players on, unless it's a middle school band piece, because then your whole goal with that is to hopefully teach them something and have them think it was fun to learn it, and they learned it almost by accident because it was so fun to go through the process of playing the piece, and then they want to play in high school band. You know, like I feel like part of my job with the educational stuff is to keep people interested in staying in music. But by the time you're here, I give up on you, so like it's, but you know, just the college stuff I'm writing more for, it's more about what I want the audience to experience. Because for a middle school piece, the audience is all parents, and they're gonna love it no matter what you do. Like, they're clapping, that's an easy crowd to please. But, you know, once you get to university level or professionals, it's more about how do I make the best piece, not how do I keep the percussionist from setting something on fire because you gave them too many rests. Like, you know. But I think in middle school, you have to be worried about them setting stuff on fire.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you're a percussionist.
Right? I am a percussionist. Thank you. We have a few minutes left, and I want to make sure I ask one more question before we see what other questions the students have. One of the focuses of our school is on entrepreneurship, and I know that you have been a great model for many other composers who have come, you know, since you started writing, especially for band, in your entrepreneurial spirit and the way you have not only composed, but found your unique voice and found a way to engage with other people, market yourself, control your own distribution and publishing, and you've been quite successful in that vein. Can you maybe just talk a little bit about your path as an entrepreneur, or if there are things, you know, any nuggets of wisdom you can share with our students about, you know, as they venture out on their path, just some things to keep in mind?
Yeah, I mean, so I self-publish everything. Like, I meet a lot of young composers and like, oh, I wrote this great piece. I hope I can get it published. And I'm like, you don't want to do that. But the reason is, like, if you have a publisher, publishers get 90% of the price of a piece of music. Or if it's a rental piece, which is a whole other thing we don't have to talk about, but if it's a rental, the publisher gets 50% of the rental fee, but 90% of the sales price. And like, that's dumb. I don't understand how that business model works. We were in LA once and visiting a friend of my wife's who is a director, And I was like, yeah, it's like a 90-10 split. And he's like, yeah, that makes sense. That's, your agent gets like 10%. Like, no, the publisher gets 90%. I get 10%. And he's like, that's stupid. So like, that makes the standard publishing model does not make any sense to me. I could not make a living if I didn't publish my own music. But that means that I have to arrange for it to be printed. I have to arrange distribution. Anytime a school wants to order a piece, there's like purchase orders and stuff. And for years, I used to bind all my own music by hand, and like eventually, I don't anymore. Like I have a staff now that does that stuff because I would never write any music. But starting out, I was the one filling every order and like spending most of my time just at the post office or packaging stuff up. But because I only own all the copyrights, it means that if you buy a piece, I get 100% of that. And if you rent a piece, I get 100%. If you perform a piece and you are in a college group or professional group, I get performance royalties from BMI, and I get 100% of that. So like that's the kind of thing that it's the only way I can make a living is by having complete ownership. It also means that if a high school wants to use my music in a marching show, which happens a lot, I control the licensing for that, and so but it does mean if a school marches something and they didn't pay for it, now I'm the one who has to go after them and be like, that's a copyright infringement now. And so there are pros and cons to being the face of all of that, which is again why I wanted to have a staff, because now she's the bad guy. Like if someone doesn't pay their bill on time, she's the one that's like, you're making Mr. Mackey mad. And so like then, but if it is me, like, I really want my money, like that's not as cool. And also I'm a softie, if you ask me directly. I eventually learned that if people ask me for something, I feel bad saying no to like, okay, it's free. But like that's a lie, it's never free. But like, but I would, she's just like, no, that's the price. And so it's good to have someone who like is the face of all that stuff. And the reason I own my own copyrights is because no one wanted them, honestly. Like, when I wrote my first band piece, Boozy and Hawks, which is like, who published like Copeland, they wanted to publish the band version of Red Line Tango, my first band piece, but they didn't want the orchestra version, and they didn't want any of my other music. They just wanted the one piece that clearly was gonna make money. And then I figured out, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would I let you just take a bunch of money that's gonna make anyway, just because of the piece? It does mean that I'm responsible for marketing it all myself, which is harder and harder to do, because social media has made that much more difficult with the way the algorithms work. It's hard for me to like share a piece on social media and have you actually see it unless it's contained within the confines of that social media service. Like if I link to a YouTube video on Facebook, if any of you were on Facebook and saw that, you wouldn't see that post because the algorithm downvotes external links to keep you on Facebook. But if I make a Facebook video of the piece and post that, then you will see it. Like there are ways around this. Also, if I want to talk about a piece on Facebook, I need to mention death or babies in order for you to see it, because some political buzzword, then Facebook's like, oh, this'll get people going, and then they'll show it to people. So I've had to post things about a new piece, like Abby and I are so excited to welcome our new baby into the world, Asphalt Cocktail or whatever. and then Facebook's like, look at this, and I'm like, so it's really tough because the only marketing I really have at this point is social media, and it used to be 10 years ago was easier because everyone was on Facebook and the algorithm wasn't as picky. Now it's a lot trickier to figure out ways to get engagement. I'm much more active on Instagram now than on Facebook, but it's really hard to market a piece on Instagram because I can talk about a trip, I'll put the picture that I took of all of you, I'll put on my Instagram story where this is done, but that's not gonna get people to order my music. It might remind people I exist, which is still useful, but it's not gonna be like, oh, we should buy that piece. So it's tough. I don't have a good answer for it. You've just gotta be, if you own the copyrights, you get all the money, but you have to do a lot of other work that publishers, in theory, would do for you otherwise.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Are we out of time?
We're out of time.
Oh, only got to 2.
Thank you, everybody. Hopefully we will see you on Sunday at the concert of John's Music. Have a great weekend.